utilised Haight-Ashbury as a place to sort of get noticed and stuff.
And it was a bit like a magnet, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Attracting certain types of people who they want to get away from their parents. They want to risk having a completely fantastic new lifestyle.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting. They're going to meet new people. They're going to have new ideas.
Absolutely.
That's where they all went to.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a sort of Carnaby Street, Camden type thing. It's a place where this is where it's at. This is where it's happening. And yeah, you kids, you can come along here. And certainly at the beginning, it was quite a. It was basically, there was a lot of helping one another. There was organisations like the Diggers that would make sure that everyone had food and that everybody had a place to stay and that people were safe. But it didn't take very long for biker gangs and drug dealers to come in. And like by the end of 1967, it was quite dangerous actually in the Haight, because there was a lot of Hells Angels, Straight Satans, people selling speeds, people selling heroin. A lot of heroin was coming back from Vietnam at that time as well.
Now, in the book, Neil, there's a report from some academic establishment which actually investigated this whole communal living and free love thing. And they state in this report that there were 200, or around about that number, different communities in the sort of Los Angeles area where, well, it actually explains that there are different types of communal living, where you might have one type where there's one male who's bonking all the females, or you might have it's a group of sort of little families in a commune, or indeed other possibilities, right? Some of which involves a lot of taking of drugs. So just tell us about that. I mean, do you think? Because if you go back in history, you'll find civilizations where they live in that way, where they would have a harem, for example. That's
or
an example of that.
Or tribes, or that type of thing. Absolutely. Well, yeah, there was. I mean, again, it was more a sort of rejection of sort of normal or accepted societal values that allowed people. I mean, you know, there's still communes that exist. I mean, Dial House is still going off. You know, Penny Rimbaud of Crass still runs that, and. The idea was that basically, dependent on the type of commune, that we're accepting of you. You can be here and we can all be on an equal setting or whatever, dependent on the thing. Some of it, obviously, you know, I think quite a lot of wily characters just looked at this and went, yeah, I could get some girls off the back of this. And who can blame them?
Yeah, and maybe some drugs as well, perhaps.
Well, yeah.
So, all right then. But do you think that this possibly troubled central government?
Yeah, possibly.
They're thinking, oh my God, this is going to take over the United States.
Yeah,
do you think that's what their thinking was?
I think definitely, certainly after the Manson case, they utilised the concept of the Manson family to demonise that whole thing. I mean, there were other ones. There's like Hope Farm, which the Manson collective actually got kicked off of, and various other places like that where. So it wasn't uncommon. In fact, what's quite strange is I found about at least 3 or 4 communes, cults, whatever you want to call them, that actually attributed them. They called themselves the Family, which was the name that was erroneously given to Charles Manson, actually, like and his group. But yeah, I mean, there was even that one that Mendax, what's his name, blonde guy, hacker. He was
Assange.
Yeah,
allegedly.
He was in an Australian one called The Family, wasn't he?
Yeah, that was called The Family. That was that particular cult.
But there was a few. There's a film called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace by Adam Curtis, who did Pair of Nightmares. And there's a section in there where he talks about a communal group.
Right.
But there were also sort of like, you know, it was only in the 50s that the groups like Scientology started to emerge, and they were not dissimilar in as much as, like, you know, they're a religious order whereby, you know, you go to them, you stay there, you give up your possessions, you become part of a broader collective. There was a lot of that, basically. So it was a time of change. I know that's a very glib thing, but basically a lot of people were looking for support, comfort and direction in that time.
Right. I think now a lot of people are moving. Well, when I say a lot of people, it's fashionable to want to live off-grid. In other words, they don't want any electricity. We don't want to be connected to any utilities. We want to be disconnected from the rat race. But not so much similar to how it was in the 60s, where it's more of a it's not just a practical thing. It's the whole self, your soul, everything you're given to this group and entering into a group experience, isn't it? It's more of a
it's a rejection of mainstream ideals and a sort
yeah.
of like, look, that's not what life is about. Life is about experience
Yeah.
and interaction and life, not about 9 to 5s or whatever.
Yeah.
And these communes would, in theory, and still in theory, give you the opportunity to separate yourself from society, basically.
And governments will do anything to make them look daft or ridicule them or demonise them.
Yes, yeah, because, you know, they've got a lot invested in this civilization.
Yeah, they have. All right, now let's come on to the book, Neil. I just want to ask you, because your previous 2 books were quite broad in their subject matter, mind control in the media and direct forms of mind control. This is very specific because it's just focusing on the Manson case, albeit it's a lot of detail in there. Why this book, Neil? Why Charles Manson?
I've just always been fascinated with Charles Manson, to be quite honest. He's one of these people that has become he's an icon, and I don't mean that in a good sense. I mean that in the sort of signs and signifier. He's become a representation of evil. He's transcended the crimes that he committed. He's transcended the sort of position that he holds in society to become something far more. What's bizarre is that basically we'll go now W.H. Smith's and find a dozen serial killer books, A to Z of serial killers, and his face will be on the cover. It's widely known that basically Manson didn't actually kill anybody. He's not a serial killer. Some people will say, well, that's splitting hairs, he was behind it. Well, you know, we'll come on to that later. But the other thing is that basically when I started to write this book, I had an idea of what the answer would be, what was going to be behind the murders, what was going to be the sort of the driving factor in Manson, what the cover-up was about, etc., etc., etc. And bizarrely, the more I investigated it, the more I became convinced that was actually wrong. And the conclusion that I came up with in the end is very different to the one I actually began with.
Right. So it involves a cover-up, you think?
Yeah.
This
Definitely.
case. So all right. Now the book is split. The first third of the book, you've pretty much gone through the official story.
Yes.
And the trial.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of quotes from the trial and the different lawyers involved and the different characters involved.
Yeah.
The second 2/3 of the book, really, you're charting Manson's life. Well, right from his childhood through his prison years, and then when he gets out of prison in the mid-60s, and then he starts building this harem up, basically, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Well, so do you want to tell us what is the official story that a lot of people who have heard of Charles Manson will identify with and know that you pretty much knocked down in this book, I have to say. So what's the official story?
Well, firstly, the reason that I've said it out like that is so that basically anybody that doesn't have a clue who Charles Manson is could read this book and they could understand it. People that know the official story and accept that can read this book and they can understand it. People that basically have always thought that doesn't quite sit right with me, again, hopefully there'll be it'll be easy for them to understand. And what I sort of had to do was explain the official story before, so that to ensure that people knew it, before I could then say, now, forget all that. That's nonsense. And so it goes from the murders up until the end of the trial, and then it starts again when he's born and goes up to the trial again, basically. The official story is that Charles Manson was a lifetime criminal, came out of prison in 67, and basically went to the Haight-Ashbury and started hooking up with a group of girls and some lads as well, and slowly sort of built up this collective of followers, so to speak. They would drive around. Firstly, they were in a Volkswagen bus, and for whatever reason, he somehow seemed to sort of enamour himself with people at Universal Studios and be able to get in with certain celebrities at the time. And the official story is that essentially he wheedled his way into the sort of good graces of Terry Melcher, who was Doris Day's son and a record producer at the time. He produced the Byrds and some of the Beach Boys and such like that. And also Dennis Wilson, who was the drummer from the Beach Boys. He basically moved into Dennis's house and started apparently leeching him dry of all these things, on the understanding that him and perhaps Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of his followers, were to be given a record contract. basically what happened was he was involved in the shooting of a drug dealer called Bernard Lotzer Papa Crow. And when this got back to the people, this sort of kiboshed any chance of a music thing. Now, Terry Melcher will actually tell you that basically they didn't pursue any music with Manson because he wasn't particularly good. That's not true at all, and there's a lot of evidence that proves that. Upon rejection from the music industry, he decided to enact this plan. He felt strongly that...
Just before you, I'll just expand a bit on that, Neil. But over the years prior to this, he's built up maybe 15, 16, 17 women who were all making love to him, and he's living on it. Well, they lived in various places, but there was a particular ranch that they got control of.
Yeah.
And
Chatsworth,
they were predominantly females. That and the official story states that he was essentially mind controlling all of the people who were his followers.
Yeah. Basically, this is the point, that he led a cult, and through the use of LSD, communal sex, and stripping of identities, giving people new names and that type of thing, which again is not true. What he was able to do was basically make these people his acolytes, his complete acolytes that would follow him, and they actually believed him to be Jesus, or the reincarnation of Jesus. He himself apparently felt that he was Jesus and also the devil, and he had sort of elements of both of this, according to the official story. Now, using LSD and mystical religious iconography and a bit of prison patter and stuff like that, he convinced all his followers that there was going to be a race war, an apocalyptic race war that was going to come into fruition at any time soon, which he called apparently Helter Skelter. What the idea of Helter Skelter was that basically the disgruntled black population would rise up against the white oppressors and start murdering people at random. This would basically expand into a race war that would finish the entire planet. Manson and his canny followers would go off and hide in the desert. They were looking for this apparent place called the Bottomless Pit. The Bottomless Pit was a sort of Hopi Indian myth that it's kind of like the entrance to like Shangri-La or whatever. It's sort of like an underground like cavern whereby you could live. And the idea was that Manson would live there for 144 till such time that his followers rose to 144,000, at which point they would re-emerge, go back into society, and sort of take hands on the tiller. They would sort of take over from the black man, who he felt would not have the experience to run society well, and so would really sort of be pleased when Manson came back and sort of take over the world. According to the official story, a lot of this was informed through the music of the Beatles, who he felt was actually giving him messages. Again, this is not true, but this is where he was getting this concept of Helter Skelter. Now,
so this is from the White Album?
This is from the White Album, absolutely. And basically, in order to sort of get some money for them going away to the desert, the official story is that they went over to a gentleman called Gary Hinman's house to try and steal $20,000 from him. This all went very badly, and he was killed. Following this, there was a raid on the ranch, and basically a couple of the people got arrested, and Sandra Good and Mary Bruner got arrested for credit card fraud. So in a rage, he decided to start Helter Skelter, and so the official story goes that basically he sent out various of his acolytes to the home where Terry Melcher used to live, which was 10050 Cielo Drive, which just so happened Terry Melcher didn't live there anymore. It was home to Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate, and they had some friends staying there, which was Wojciech Wachowski, his girlfriend Abigail Folger, who was the heir to the Folger coffee empire, and Jay Sebring, who was a former boyfriend of Sharon, and also he was the hairdresser to the stars. He basically invented or popularized and made it okay for men to take care of their appearance, to He introduced shampoo and scissors, and before that, basically, men would have their hair cut with clippers.
Is this the birth of the metrosexual?
It may well be. It was actually a film involving Warren Beatty, who was involved in the story later on.
Right.
He was. It's called Shampoo. You may have seen it. That's the story of Jay Sebring. And if he hadn't have died, Sebring International would be the name that you knew instead of, say, Vidal Sassoon or something like that. But unfortunately, these were all murdered by Tex Watson, apparently at the behest of Charles Manson. The following night, Manson sent Tex out again to the home of, apparently at random, to the home of Rosemary and Lino LaBianca, who Tex murdered, and then they went back to the ranch. At this point, they were trying to move out to a ranch called the Myers and Barker Ranch, which is actually out in the desert, which was even further sort of removed from society.
So at these two murder scenes, with Tex Watson, who, was with three women as well of Manson followers,
Yeah.
And the story is that they were almost like just under complete mind control, following his orders. They've killed those 5, and then on another night they've killed another 2, which is part of this really potty, ridiculous plan, this helter-skelter thing. Who knows, Manson might have been brainwashed, but he'd brainwashed these other people, and basically he was ultimately responsible for all the murders.
Yeah.
We're talking 7 people, 5 at the first one and 2 at the second.
Yeah.
So that's really what the trials stated. And they actually gave one of the Manson followers exemption from prosecution in order to start it. So just tell us about that.
Well, initially what happened was, the prosecution case was that these murders at the Tate and LaBianca homes were completely random, and they were just purely to initiate a response from the black population to cause helter-skelter. Now, immediately you might ask, well,
what we're saying here, just for people who aren't following this is the motive that was sold or put forward at the trial. That Manson was essentially mad, but he was very, very good at controlling people through hypnosis or mind control, and he'd orchestrated this completely crazy plot to start a race war.
Yeah.
That's what they were saying at the trial.
Which apparently he would term helter-skelter. Now, you might question, why did they stop? You know, if you killed 2 people to actually initiate helter-skelter, why did they stop? Because helter-skelter didn't start. You could also make the question, why did they start helter-skelter before they found the bottomless pit, which was obviously the place where they were supposedly going to go and hide. Now, what happened was, because at the murder of Gary Hinman, Susan Atkins, who was, again...
so just to interrupt you there for people who aren't following, Neil, this is a murder which occurred before these 2 murders at these particular households, which circumstances from that may have led to these other murders.
They certainly did,
right.
yeah.
This is Gary Hinman, who was on the ranch, is that right?
No, Gary Hinman lived on his own, like away from the ranch. Well, basically what it was that Susan Atkins was actually present at the murder of Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman was a mescaline dealer and a friend of Manson, Bosley, Dennis Wilson, and various other people. For whatever reason, Bobby Bosley felt inclined to go over there and try and get some money off of him. Now, the prosecution said that Manson sent him over there to get $20,000 in order to help helter-skelter. And when Hinman refused, Bobby killed him. That's not the reason for the murder at all. The reason was actually to do with a gentleman called Danny DiCarlo, who was a straight Satan motorcyclist. But basically, there was a raid on the ranch because at the Manson group they were stripping down cars, they were stealing cars, they were turning them into dune buggies and then selling on the car parts at a huge profit, sometimes back to the very, very same dealerships that they actually stole them from. Mm-hmm. When a lot of them were arrested off the back of this, they found evidence that connected Susan Atkins to the murder of Gary Hinman. Mm-hmm. During the investigation, basically, somebody described Susan Atkins describing stabbing somebody, and they worked out from the details of the Gary Hinman case that this must have been a completely different murder. Mm-hmm. So what is this that Susan's actually confessing to? So when she's in jail, completely sort of apropos of nothing really, Susan is approached by two very wealthy lawyers, one called Paul Caruso, one called Richard Calabrero, who it's never been explained who paid for these. These were really high-priced lawyers. These were like, you know, a couple $100 an hour. And both of them usually had a reputation for dealing with sort of well-dressed Italian businessmen types, you know, the sort of people that might sit in restaurants or outside coffee shops all day discussing business, mafia types. But they approached Susan Atkins, who's this, you know, teenager who's in on double murder or whatever, and for completely no reason at all, it says, we'll take your case, completely pro bono. We don't require any money off you at all. All that they required of her was two things. One, that she write out a detailed confession of everything that happened, the motivation behind it, who Charles Manson was, helter-skelter, the reason that they killed the people at the Tate house. And their other caveat was that they owned the rights to this. So basically, before the trial had even started, shortly after Susan Atkins had made this fabulous confession about helter-skelter and the cult of Manson and various other celebrities, including Frank Sinatra and Tom Jones, that they'd planned to kill, this was released throughout the Los Angeles press. Basically, the lawyers had arranged for the entire story to be released in the Los Angeles Times in a serialized way, so that the entirety of the country knew the story before the trial had started. It was then passed on to a gentleman called Lawrence Schiller, who actually contained all this in a book called The Killing of Sharon Tate, which was again released before the trial started.
Yeah, so you think that the trial should have been a mistrial for multiple reasons?
There's about 6 reasons why it should have been a complete mistrial, basically. I mean, that, regardless of what you think, that makes the trial completely unfair. There's no way that anybody would not be prejudiced by this story that was in the media and in this book, basically. And it's incredibly strange practice that's never really happened before. I don't think it's really happened since, because, as I say, it would prejudice the case.
Right.
But this is exactly what did happen. What was very, very strange is very shortly before the trial was due to start, after this confession had come out from Susan Atkins, she actually turned around and denounced it. She basically said that she was put in a position whereby she was told, if you don't give us this story, you're going to the death penalty, and we're going to make sure that your child is sent to an orphanage, and a bad orphanage as well. We're going to, like, you know.
Now, it seemed there's one particular lawyer who really seemed to be orchestrating the whole case, the prosecution lawyer, who was essentially selling this story.
Vincent Bugliosi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and you think that the mafia is essentially behind him?
I think that there's enough things that he's mentioned in conversation to Charles Manson that indicates that. I mean, apparently Charles Manson was offered, right at the start of the trial, an 18-month sentence if he just turned over and admitted that Tex was behind the killings. And he turned this down because he's you know, his expression is he walks the line. He's not a snitch. He spent his entire time in prison.
Right. Well, let's come on to that then. Let's come on to that, Neil. So we'll just go from his troubled childhood up to him spending a lot of years in prison for very little, really, in his earlier years.
Yeah, he wasn't a lucky guy.
Yeah, and he met various very influential people in
prison. Yeah, throughout his time.
Who were in the mafia, basically. Just tell us about that. Tell us about the few people he met.
The first person of influence that he actually met was a gentleman called Frank Costello. Frank Costello is, he's sort of known by his other title, which is the Prime Minister of Crime. He was an incredibly influential mafia figure that rose to the very pinnacle of certain families. He's one of these people that was actually brought before Congress to sort of explain himself, and there's a very famous interchange where somebody says, "What have you ever done for this country?" And he responds, "I've paid my taxes," which is a nice off-the-cuff thing. But essentially, he had incredible sway in the prison. Whether this is strictly true or not is debated, but there is a story that Manson tells about, or somebody tells that they claim Manson has said, about Frank Costello reading his newspaper in prison and just refusing not to read his newspaper, even though the guards would say, you know, that's not on. He says, look, I read it at home, I'm going to read it here. And this is the influence that he had. Shortly after his introduction to Frank Costello, Manson, who at that point has got a fairly sort of scrappy prison record, you know, instances of sort of fighting, instances of homosexual rape, although for some reason they're not included in his criminal record, and is considered a dangerous but quite intelligent psychopath. He knuckles down and all of a sudden learns about cars, he goes on a sort of engine management course and learns how to be a mechanic. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't tend to point is that he was a car thief before this, and he became an even better car thief just after that. So off the back of speaking to Frank Costello, he knuckles down, gets involved in this industry, this mechanics course, and then upon release immediately starts stealing cars and running them down to places like Texas and stuff, where he also just so happens to start pimping out girls.
Right. I was just going to say, the other two industries that he was very proficient in was being a pimp,
Yeah.
and also buying and selling drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, like, you can't move cars from California down to Texas. You can't move girls across country without attracting at some point the interest of, you know, some sort of organised crime. In the mid-50s, he was actually, was a pimp in Hollywood at a place called 3 Star Enterprises, which by strange coincidence was next door to where Bernard Crowe, Lots of Papa, would later set up shop. And what he was doing there was it was a acting agency, but essentially an escort agency, and he was getting young girls in off the street, getting them to do pornographic photos and films, and then, if he could, setting them up with clients and then selling all the films. And this sort of collapsed when the father of one of these girls got wind of it and turned up at the office. Now, one of the strange things that's rather overlooked is that his partner in crime at the time was a chap called Tony Cassini. Tony Cassini was under investigation by the FBI because he was a member of the mafia. Following this, Manson, there's a bit more that went on, but essentially he went down to Texas and then went to Mexico to escape certain charges of pimping, essentially. Now, while he was in Mexico, he did a few things. He learnt to bullfight, he learnt to cliff dive, but he's also, in a lot of interviews, basically said that he was moving cocaine around, that he was moving cocaine for the mafia. Now, this would make sense because at that point, prior to this sort of the overthrow of Batista, like it was Cuba to Miami. That was where all the drugs were coming. That's where Lucky Luciano had set up his casino enterprises. And it was only when Batista fell that the mafia felt that it was more profitable and viable to move to Las Vegas with the help of Bugsy Siegel. Now, interestingly, it was actually Frank Sinatra that helped popularize Las Vegas as a holiday destination. You know, his star power was the pull that would allow Bugsy Siegel to sort of build this. And Sinatra was friends with Bugsy Siegel. Sinatra was also basically owned by Sam Giancana. He was friends with Lucky Luciano, and he was actually called to Cuba to sing at one of the mafia's big conferences, and he went there with the Fischetti brothers, who were again very, very sort of high-ranking mafia people. So yeah, but also whilst he's down there as well, Manson is given the hint that he's left a couple of bodies on the beach and carried a Magnum around as well. So the indication is that he was involved in some sort of low-level crime at that point. I don't think he was in the mafia by any stretch of the imagination. Of course not. He was just, you know, if you are a drug dealer, pimp, mover of stolen vehicles and stuff like that, occasionally you're going to rub up against these people, and it's better to be in with them than not with them, basically.
There are many instances throughout the book where he's committing minor crimes regularly, and he's on parole, so he should be recalled back to prison. So just tell us, so you think that's because there's someone in the mafia protecting him?
Well, very possibly. I mean, throughout the 60s, he committed about 6 or 7 major felonies. Like, he was on parole, okay, and he never had a place of residence. He never had a job. And those are the two things that you need to get if you're on parole. And he never had anything that looked even a bit like that, which is very strange. And these weren't minor crimes. These were rape, statutory rape. There was things like driving without a license, possession of drugs, possession of stolen car parts, possession of weapons. Like, they knew that they had machine guns on the ranch, and for some reason, Manson was able to evade capture again and again and again and again. Now, the suggestion is, after he was in Mexico, basically these pimping charges caught up with him, and he was sent to prison. Now, he met several other people whilst he was in prison. One of them was a chap called Creepy Carpus. Now, Creepy Carpus was a member of the Mar Barker gang, which was, you know, a gang that went around robbing institutions. And I think he was the person that had the longest time at Alcatraz, Creepy Carpus, and he basically kind of took Manson under his wing. He taught him a few things on guitar and stuff like that. He'd previously learned guitar at, I think it was Give Up Boys Home. He was taught it. We also learned to box. Manson was actually a very, very good boxer. And Creepy Carpus, just before Manson was going to get out, what he did was he wrote to some people for him. He wrote to Frankie Carbo, and who was an incredibly influential mafia figure, and he also wrote to Mickey Cohen. Now, Mickey Cohen was basically in charge of like entertainment on the West Coast. So basically, like, if you want to get in clubs in San Francisco, you need to speak to Mickey Cohen. Now, did this have any influence on Manson? Well, we kind of know that it did, because Mickey Cohen wrote back to Creepy Carpus saying, yeah, fine, send this lad over to these clubs or whatever. When Manson first turned up in San Francisco, there's a guy who was the sort of conduit for him getting into playing clubs. And to be fair, this guy actually said that no, he's not suitable for this type of club, it's suitable for this type of club. But this guy was well known in the industry as being like a sort of a conduit for mafia. The mafia basically went from owning the jukeboxes to owning the radio stations and payola, to owning the record companies, to owning the artists. And, you know, they can spread their influence either through providing drugs, providing protection, or whatever. I mean, one of the biggest cases, as I say, is Johnny Rosselli, who got Frank Sinatra out of his contract with Tommy Dorsey by making him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Right, yeah. And that long list that is on the back of your book, Neil, of famous people,
yeah.
You think that a lot of them are connected to the mafia?
Well, some of them are, and some of them aren't. Like, I mean, the connection to the mafia is really tangential, in as much as basically it was the mafia that was providing the drugs. It was the mafia that had the ability to oversee other criminal enterprises, the production of pornography, the use of girls for pimping and that type of thing. Just prior to his release in the late 60s, Manson was visited by a gentleman called George Shibley. Now, George Shibley was another one of these lawyers that people just... He was a $250 an hour Beverly Hills lawyer in the late 60s, so that's mega, mega money. And he spent a serious amount of time chatting with Charles Manson before his release, and this was never fully explained.
So this is before he's built up his harem,
yeah.
and mind controlled all these women. Well,
yeah.
mind controlled all these women and started building up an empire for himself.
Yeah.
Before that, he's
yeah,
got out of prison with nothing.
Yeah, he's got
apart from some contacts.
Apart from some
and
contacts,
a bit
yeah.
of a, you know,
a bit of savvy, bit of
criminal savvy, and a charmer and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories about when he's in prison about his hypnotic powers, like, and basically, this is where you start to realise that a lot of the things that you know about Charles Manson are disinformation. There was a book called Charles Manson in His Own Words, which was written by Newell Emmons, and people think this is a very good book. It's not. It's been widely rejected by Manson as being completely false. Apparently, Newell Emmons wrote the truth, took it to the publishing company, and they said, no chance, mate, change that. And,
right.
and go along with the story, which is the book Helter Skelter, which was Vincent Bugliosi.
Right.
Yeah, basically the stories of him in prison are things like him being able to hypnotise people with the use of headphones. He would hang headphones off people's beds whilst they were sleeping, and he'd have pre-recorded a message, and this would go into their heads whilst they were sleeping. And he used this to win a talent contest, for example, with his Bambi Okies and stuff like that. It's not true, and I can tell you why it's not true, because that doesn't work. When you're asleep, your state is not receptive to hypnotic command. So that's nonsense. That's just a story that is sort of put about to give the idea that he became this incredibly manipulative person. He was actually interested in Scientology. Once he was in prison, he had over 150 hours of auditing, which is the interviewing process by which you release your thetans, during with a chap called Lania Rainier. And Lania Rainier basically claimed, so this turned out to be a lie, but he claimed to have known personally L. Ron Hubbard and to have been trained by himself. But so it wasn't an official affiliation to Scientology, but there was certainly enough being passed off. Manson credits Scientology with curing his depression. Like, he spent a long time in the hole when he was quite young, isolation. And he credits Scientology with being able to withstand that, and this concept of coming to now, being in the now. Like, there's stories where people say, you're never going to get out of prison, Charles, you're never going to get out of prison. And you'll turn around to them and say, what prison? I'm not in prison. I'm me. I'm me wherever I am. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. And this is actually a concept that's taken from Scientology. A lot of the things that that you would attribute to Manson, like answering a question with the same question, like there's an interchange where apparently he spoke to Linda Kasabian, and she says, I like the ranch. And he goes, I like the ranch. I'd love to live on the ranch. I'd love to live on the ranch. Can I live on the ranch? Can I live on the ranch? And he just tracks it back. That's a Scientology TR training exercise. There's also talk of him making faces and moving his hands around, and you have to follow him. That's a TR. That's a training exercise of Scientology. Being able to sit there and absorb insults without any reaction at all, which we know Manson was famous for, that's called bull baiting. It's a Scientology training exercise. And so whilst he's in prison, he's absorbing all these different things. What a lot of people say is that he read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, and this was something that allowed him to become a cult leader, so to speak. Personally, I think this is where you start to see people mashing together disparate bits to try and build a picture of Charles Manson that is not strictly accurate.
So let's just come on to what you think might have really been going on there with these two murders, or two murder scenes with 7 murders.
Yeah.
You've got Zebring, who was, you said he was a hairdresser, but he was also a very prominent drug dealer.
Yeah.
And he was dealing drugs to all of these famous people.
Yeah, Sebring was
cutting their hair and then giving them a bit of cocaine or whatever they wanted.
Absolutely,
right?
and this has been confirmed by Steve McQueen's wife.
Right. And the other household that the murders had, there was possibly
Connections.
drug connections there, and other, well, let's say fraud connections as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But the actual group, the family as they were called, Manson's group, had many links to both these properties and people at the properties. Yeah. So it wasn't random. The motives was connected to drugs and trying to protect people who have been using and supplying drugs that they don't want to hang out to dry. So Manson's a scapegoat, and this whole mind control thing is invented in order to protect a whole load of famous people. That's what, is that?
Essentially the cult leader aspect of it, the helter-skelter aspect of it, the random nature of it, and his rejection by the music industry, that's all nonsense. Like that is...
So he was potentially going to get a decent recording contract, you think?
He had a record contract with Brother Records, which was the record contract that was owned by the Beach Boys. He recorded an album. He recorded over 300 hours of material at Brian Wilson's bedroom studio. Brian Wilson is the genius leader of the Beach Boys who wrote Pet Sounds. The only other person that ever recorded at Brian Wilson's studio was the Beach Boys. That is incredibly...
So you think he was much more closely linked to the Beach Boys than people say?
Oh, yeah.
And the reason why they've chosen Helter Skelter and the White Album to demonize him is to take away that, to take the attention off the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
So you think they were trying to protect the Beach Boys in the trial?
Absolutely. Nick Grillo, who was the Beach Boys manager, who was connected to the Mafia, I think it was him that introduced the concept of the Beatles, because the Beatles were essentially their commercial rivals, and also they weren't in America at the time.
Yeah,
so
they're in another country.
Yeah.
So fair game, I suppose, isn't it?
What happened with regards to Dennis Wilson? Now, the story is that Dennis Wilson was...
So he was the heartthrob of the band as well,
Yeah,
was he?
yeah, he's a really good-looking guy. He's the only person that could actually surf. The rest of the Beach Boys,
Oh, right.
genius as they actually were...
Only
like-
one of them could surf.
Yeah. Genius as they were a little bit sort of buttoned down, if you know what I mean. They weren't as sexy as Dennis. Dennis was a good-looking guy and like, you know, proper beach body and all that. And the story is that Susan Atkins and Ella Jo Bailey were hitchhiking and they managed to flag down Dennis Wilson and basically went to his house, and then later they went back to Manson and says, look, we've got this fabulous house, and Manson just turns up en masse and basically decides to stay there. This is not strictly true. Okay, Manson had already been sort of mysteriously enamored with people like Gary Stromberg. Gary Stromberg had set him up to do demos at Universal Studios and places like that. He'd already been sort of like involved in script writing for various films. There's a story that basically is utilised to highlight the concept that Charles Manson is racist, which we'll come on to in a bit, where apparently he was doing a story of Jesus, and when they said that they wanted a black actor to play Jesus, he rejected it and just stormed out. It's not true. This film never really happened. Like, why the relationship between them broke down is not entirely clear, but Gary Stromberg was paying for rehearsals for him after that for an awful long time. So the story is that Dennis Wilson basically met him when he just turned up at his house. That's not true. Where Dennis Wilson first met Charles Manson was at Gary Hinman's house when they were buying mescaline. Now, that's a rumour, it's not been 100% confirmed. What has been confirmed is that the time where it was arranged for him to go and stay with Dennis Wilson was at Elvis Presley's house. Now, they were playing cards when Elvis wasn't there. He had a house in Hollywood, and basically when he wasn't there, and sometimes when he was there, they'd turn up and they'd gamble, which was obviously illegal at the time. And the suggestion is that this was probably overseen by a certain element of organised crime. Dennis had split up with his wife, and so basically he wanted some company. And so Manson's there with a group of girls and access to drugs, a lot of drugs. And Dennis likes that. So basically he says, you know, you won this hand at cards, rather than me pay you the money I owe you, why don't you come live with me? And so he did, and this was in 1968, this was in the summer of 1968. Dennis's friends at the time were Greg Jacobson and Terry Melcher, and upon meeting Charles Manson in 1968, they basically decided that it would be a really good idea to do an album. And this is Manson, you can't do it on your own. You need to have a group behind you. Why don't you get Bobby Bosley to play guitar, the lads to play the instruments, and the girls, they can be singers. They can be backing singers, like a sort of like Pan's People or something as well. Like, do you know what I mean? Like a sort of eye candy. And they were going to call this this group the Family Jams. Charles Manson and the Family Jams. So the Family is actually the musical group that they were looking at. Now, this happened in 1968. This is confirmed by Greg Jacobson, Van Dyke Parks, even Terry Melcher. In fact, it was actually Dina Martin, who was Dean Martin's daughter. She accidentally wrote in her autobiography about a party that started at Dennis Wilson's house, went to Mama Cass's house via Elvis's house, and then finally ended up at Cielo Drive at Terry Melcher's house, at which Charles Manson was there. He was there at Cielo Drive a year before Terry Melcher claims to have met him. Terry Melcher says that he only met him briefly in 1969, and that he immediately decided this guy was talentless and just couldn't be bothered with it. It's not true. Him and Greg Jacobson were arranging to have a documentary to coincide with the release of the album, which was going to be called The Family Jams, which was going to be released on Brother Records, which was the record company owned by
So you think
the Beach Boys.
that name, The Family, at the trial was perverted to become the name of a cult, which didn't actually exist?
Yeah, one of the...
You just think it was Manson with a harem, essentially.
Manson with a group of girls, with a stable of girls. He's a pimp. You could, like, he's even got a bottom bitch, which is basically the girl that controls the other girls, which is Squeaky. You can see how
bottom bitch.
Yeah, it's just a phrase that it basically means it's your girl that's in charge, that basically she's your number one girl, but she's going to keep all the other girls in line.
I'll shut that down. Bottom, right, yeah.
So, and this is what Squeaky does. She actually, you know, does this. Squeaky's the little redhead girl, Lynette Fromm, who would later try and assassinate Gerald Ford.
Right.
But yeah, what's strange?
So let me just ask you then, Neil. There's video that I've seen at the trial, right, where they've got three of the girls. They all dress the same and they've got the haircut the same, and they're coming out and they're all smiling at this really serious murder trial.
Yeah.
They've got these smiles on their faces, seemingly orchestrated.
Yeah.
And people say, well, look, they're under mind control.
They're certainly on acid, because somebody was feeding acid to them all the way through the trial. There's a lot where you can actually watch Manson desperately struggling not to, like, fall off his chair. He's so high. Right. Like, somebody was mucking about with the trial.
So you don't think that was those girls were doing that under the command of Manson's mind control?
I don't think they were doing it under the command of Manson. No, certainly not. No.
Right. Right.
I mean, one of the things as well is that basically a lot of these things, like the concept of the family, like the concept that the trial was slightly unfair, are discussed by Manson. This is one of the main sort of points that I've got in the book, is that I've gone, nobody ever bothers to listen to what Manson says in his interviews.
Yeah, I can understand that though. It's you really, because you've got a lot of quotes from Manson in the book, right? And when you read them, there's clearly meaning in there, but you really have to sit and study them to understand what he's talking about. A lot of them are cryptic. Yeah,
absolutely.
But they've clearly got meaning, and he's using metaphors as well a lot of the time.
Yeah, there's a lot of revelations and stuff like that are sort of hidden behind nicknames and things like that. Like, he'll call Bobby Beausoleil the Frenchman, and
he has a word for the mafia as well, doesn't he?
New York,
right?
Or the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Cross. Any time that he's making a reference to that, he's talking about New York.
Right.
Sorry, he's talking about the mafia.
Because obviously people who don't, the mafia exists on each coast, and there's
different families, different factions trying to sort of get in and stuff like that. Nick Grillo, who was the mafia-connected manager of the Beach Boys, after he kicked Manson out, because Manson had written at least 2 songs for the 2020 album, which was released by the Beach Boys. This was credited
and that's
to
part
Dennis
of the contention, is that Manson wanted to get. He was promised to be paid, and he wasn't paid for his music. It was on the Beach Boys album.
Yeah, absolutely, and this is admitted. Like, Dennis Wilson did interviews in Rave magazine in England, where he's talking about how Manson's going to be his next big thing, and how he's already helped him write some songs, and he's going to release him, possibly under the name The Wizard, possibly under the name The Family Jams, and basically. That's certainly the case. But when Grillo refused to pay Manson, Manson turned up at his office and says, "I'm not one of these rock stars. I'll blow up your house and blow up your car." And Nick Grillo said, "Try it. I'll phone New York." And Manson said, "I'll phone New York." So that sounds nonsensical.
I remember that part in the book. He actually says, the guy says, "Okay, I haven't given you the money, the royalties for the songs that you wrote." And he says to Manson, "Well, sue me." And Manson says, "I'm not going to sue you, I'm going to blow up your house."
And he says, "Fine, I'll phone New York." And so Manson responds, he says, "No, I'll phone New York, because I ice pick New York."
Right.
Which means,
so they're both saying, well, I've got connection to the mafia. No, I've got connection to the mafia.
So it's a big mafia off, basically.
A mafia off. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, this is the point. A lot of these things are revealed in talks with Manson. So I don't want to get ahead of where we're at, but he's admitted in an interview to Hard Copy that the reason he turned up at Lino LaBianca's house is because basically he was sent there by Frankie Carbo, the mafia guy, to get a little black book. And the guy responds, he says, did you know Lino LaBianca? He says, "No, I didn't know Lino LaBianca, but Lino LaBianca knew Frankie Carbo, and I know Frankie Carbo." And that was it. And we'll come back to that in a bit, obviously. But
right. Well, I mean, it's clearly there's a lot of detail in the book that we haven't got time to go into. One thing that I do want to ask you about is the more sort of salacious aspect of what was found at the Tate property. Because Roman Polanski, this famous film director who was married to Sharon Tate, she's 8 months pregnant when she gets murdered. He's in England making a film.
Day of the Dolphin.
conveniently. I don't know whether you suspect any involvement of Polanski in the murders.
No,
You
no.
don't
There
think so?
is a theory that basically, you know, that she was sacrificed for him, and it was something to do with Alex Sanders initiating her into witchcraft on the set of The Eye of the Devil. That transpires is a lie. He
Right.
never did that. He admitted that he lied many years
Right.
later.
So after the murders, obviously the police searched the house and